The council watched in horror. They had actually declared war on Earth. Part 1. The Galactic Sovereignty Council had existed for 11,000 years. That was not a boast. It was simply a fact, the way mountains are a fact, the way deep ocean is a fact, something so old and so large that most things just accepted it without question. 47 species sat on the council. 47 different kinds of minds, bodies, and languages, all bound together by one simple idea, that power belonged to those who took it first, and kept it through force. They had never lost a war. Not one. In 11,000 years, every species they had ever approached with an ultimatum had either joined them quietly or been crushed loudly. There was no third option. The council did not believe in third options. Earth had been discovered 17 years ago by a sovereignty scout ship that was mapping the outer edge of a quiet arm of the galaxy. The scout commander had filed a standard report. 1 star. 1 habitable planet. 1 sentient species. Primitive by sovereignty standards, no faster-than-light travel, no energy shielding, no interstellar communication. They had flying machines that burned liquid fuel. They split atoms for power. They were, in the language of the Council's classification system, a Class 4 emergence. Interesting enough to watch. Too weak to fear. For 17 years, the Council had watched. They had sent silent observation drones. They had recorded human languages, human governments, human habits. They had built thick files on human history, though most council analysts had only skimmed those files, because early reports suggested the history was mostly just a long list of humans fighting each other, which did not seem useful or relevant. Eventually, the council decided it was time to act. Ambassador Vorak of the Cathari was the one who drafted the ultimatum. He was a tall creature, nearly 7 feet, with a body covered in dark gray armor plating that his species grew naturally like a shell. He was intelligent, experienced, and completely certain of himself, the way beings are certain of themselves when nothing has ever gone wrong for them. He had handled 4 planetary integrations in his career. All 4 had gone smoothly. He expected a 5th. The ultimatum was not complicated. Earth would give up its governments. Earth's resources, its water, its minerals, its biological diversity, would be managed by the Council. Humans would be protected under sovereignty law, which meant they would be housed and fed and kept safe from outside threats, but they would not be free. They would work. They would follow Council rules. They would, over time, be folded into the larger machine of sovereignty civilization, which was efficient and stable and had worked for 11,000 years. Vorak read the ultimatum aloud to the full council chamber before it was sent. The chamber was a massive circular room carved into a space station the size of a small moon, orbiting a star that was not Earth's. 47 species sat in their sections. Lights glowed. Air was filtered to suit 47 different breathing needs. Everything was orderly and calm. No one objected to the ultimatum. No one suggested that perhaps they should learn a little more about these humans before making demands. No one thought to go back and read those history files more carefully. Vorak signed the document and handed it to a courier. The courier brought it to a woman named Lyra Sohn. Lyra was human. She had been born in Oregon 38 years ago and had spent the last 10 years working as a diplomatic liaison on sovereignty stations, one of a small group of humans who had been permitted to live and work in sovereignty space as part of an observation arrangement. She spoke 4 alien languages fluently. She understood how the council thought. She understood their confidence, their assumptions, their blind spots. When Vorak handed her the document and told her to deliver it to Earth's United Nations, she read it once, folded it neatly, and put it in her bag. She did not say anything. She did not argue or protest. She simply nodded and left. On the shuttle ride back toward Earth, she sat alone and looked out the window at the stars for a very long time. She arrived in New York on a Tuesday morning. The weather was gray and cold. She walked into the United Nations building, was escorted to the main assembly hall, and was given the podium. The hall was full. Word had spread that a message was coming from the sovereignty, and every diplomat, advisor, journalist, and official who could get a seat had gotten one. Lyra read the ultimatum aloud in English first, then in 4 other languages. Her voice was steady. Her hands did not shake. The hall was completely silent while she read, and it stayed silent for a few seconds after she finished. Then a man in the third row raised his hand. His name was Colin Hartley. He was 29 years old, originally from a small town in Indiana, and he worked as a junior policy advisor for a mid-level government office. He had come to the gallery that morning with a visitor's pass borrowed from a colleague, mostly out of curiosity. He had no official standing in that room. He probably should not have raised his hand. But he did, and Lyra, who was very tired and who had found in her experience that the most useful questions usually came from unexpected places, nodded at him. "So," Colin said, choosing his words slowly, "they're telling us to hand over the whole planet. Our governments, our resources, everything. And if we don't, they'll take it by force." "That is correct," Lyra said. Colin nodded. He thought for a moment. "And they know about our history. Like, they know we've basically been at war with somebody for most of recorded human history." The hall was very quiet. Lyra looked down at the document in her hands. She thought about the council chamber. She thought about Vorek's absolute certainty. She thought about the analysts who had filed those history reports, those long thick files that everyone had skimmed and no one had truly read. "I do not believe," she said carefully, "that was a significant factor in their assessment." Colin sat back in his chair. He did not look panicked. He looked thoughtful, the way someone looks when a situation is strange but the answer to it is becoming clear. Around him, other people were whispering, pulling out phones, leaning toward each other. The noise in the hall was starting to grow. But Colin just sat there with his hands on his knees, looking at the middle distance, working something through in his head. Outside the building, the city moved the way cities always do, loud and fast and full of people going somewhere. Taxis honked. A food cart owner argued with a delivery driver. A group of school children walked past in a line, holding a rope, looking at everything with wide eyes. Up above the clouds, above the atmosphere, in the silence of orbit, a sovereignty observation drone recorded everything and sent it back to the station near Jupiter, where a Cathari communications officer filed the feed under routine surveillance and went to get his lunch. In the council chamber, light years away, Ambassador Vorek was already drafting the transition schedule. He expected a response within the week. He expected it to be a request for negotiation, for softer terms, for a slower timeline. That was what species always asked for. More time. Gentler handling. They wanted to feel like they had some control over what was happening to them, even when they did not. He was already planning what he would offer them. A longer adjustment period, perhaps. Some symbolic role in local administration. Enough to make them feel like partners rather than subjects, at least in the early years. He was in a good mood. The whole thing was going to be very straightforward. In New York, Colin Hartley finally stood up, tucked his chair in neatly, and walked toward the door. A colleague caught him in the hallway and asked where he was going. "To find somebody who handles defense," Colin said. "And I'm going to need a really big coffee." The council watched in horror. They had actually declared war on Earth. Part 2. The council expected to hear back from Earth within a week. They did not hear back in a week. They heard back in 6 days, which was close enough that Vorek did not immediately consider it strange. What was strange was the nature of the response. He had expected a message. A digital transmission, maybe a video address from whatever human leader had been chosen to speak. He had expected formal language, diplomatic tone, a careful request for softer terms. He had handled 4 of these situations before. They always followed the same shape: initial shock, quiet fear, then the slow reach toward negotiation. Instead, he got a woman walking through his door. Lyra Sohn had chartered her own shuttle from Earth, flown it to the Sovereignty's regional command station above Jupiter, docked without asking for permission, walked through the arrival bay, passed 3 security checkpoints that were too surprised to stop her, and placed a sealed envelope on the receiving desk of Station Commander Gorash before anyone had thought to call ahead and warn him she was coming. Gorash was a Thuvan, a wide-shouldered, 4-armed species with dark blue skin and eyes that sat wide on a flat face. He was not easily surprised. He had commanded this station for 9 years. He picked up the envelope and looked at it. "This is their surrender," he said. Lyra had already picked up her bag from the floor and slung it over her shoulder. "No," she said. "It is their declaration of war." She left the room before he finished opening the envelope. Gorash read the document in silence. It was 2 pages long. The first page was clean and direct, written without drama or ceremony. Earth's government, acting on behalf of its population, formally rejected the sovereignty ultimatum in full. Earth would not be transferring governance, resources, or authority to the Council or any representative body of the Council. Earth considered the ultimatum an act of aggression and reserved the right to respond accordingly. Any sovereignty vessel entering Earth's solar system without explicit, written human authorization would be treated as a hostile combatant and engaged with all available force. Gorash read it again. Then he set it on the desk and read the second page. The second page was a list. It had a short header at the top that read, simply, "For your reference." Below the header, in small, neat print, was a record of every major armed conflict in human history. Not just the well-known ones. All of them. Wars between nations. Wars between city-states. Colonial wars. Civil wars. Wars fought over religion, over land, over water, over insults, over nothing at all. The list went back thousands of years. It filled the entire page in small print, and it did not include all of them, because all of them would have required many more pages. At the bottom of the second page, one line had been written by hand. The handwriting was small and precise, the writing of someone who had spent a long time putting words on paper. "We have been preparing for this our entire history. We did not know it until now." Gorash called his 3 senior officers in and showed each of them the document without saying a word. He watched their faces as they read. The first officer, a veteran Cathari strategist, read the second page twice and then set it down very carefully, the way someone sets down something they have picked up by accident and wish they hadn't. The second officer, a younger Thuvan, read only the first page and looked confused. The third officer, a female Prothean with 6 fingers on each hand and the best analytical mind on the station, read both pages from beginning to end, sat down without being asked, and stared at the wall for 30 seconds. "Sir," she said finally. "I know," Gorash said. "Have they actually counted their own wars?" "The list suggests they have." She was quiet for another moment. "Most species stop after the first few. They find a way to cooperate. They develop systems for solving conflicts without fighting. These ones just kept going." "Yes. For 10,000 years. Longer, if you count the archaeological record." She looked at the list again. "And they're still here." "Still here," Gorash said. "Still fighting. Still building things to fight with. And now we have told them to point all of that at us." The room was quiet. Outside the station's observation windows, the gas giant Jupiter turned slowly in its bands of orange and white, enormous and unhurried, the way things are when they have been around for billions of years and do not need to impress anyone. Gorash reached for his communicator. "I need to reach the Council." The call took time to connect. Light years of distance made direct communication slow. By the time Gorash's message reached the Council chamber and a response came back, several hours had passed. The response from the Council was brief, the declaration was noted. The fleet would be dispatched as planned. Earth's refusal was expected behavior from a primitive species and would be handled with appropriate force. Gorash was to maintain surveillance and report any unusual activity in the solar system. Gorash read the response. He read it again. He set it down. He thought about that list. He thought about the handwritten line at the bottom. He thought about Lyra Sohn walking through his security checkpoints like they were not there, not because she had forced her way through but because she had simply walked as though the idea of being stopped had not occurred to her, and the guards had responded to her certainty by getting out of the way. He called Lyra's shuttle before it left the docking bay. She answered immediately, which suggested she had been expecting the call. "Your people understand," he said, "what we will send against you." There was a pause. Not a long one. "Your people understand," Lyra said, "what that means for you." The call ended. On Earth, in a building outside Washington, a retired general named Paul Decker was sitting at a long table surrounded by people who had not slept properly in 6 days. Paul was 60 years old, lean and quiet, with short gray hair and the kind of face that showed nothing unless he chose to show something. He had spent decades in uniform and more years after that in defense planning rooms, and he had a particular gift for seeing situations clearly when other people were still busy being frightened by them. He had written the declaration himself. He had also written the list, pulling from historical databases, academic records, and 3 encyclopedias, cross-checking the numbers with 2 historians who had been flown in overnight. He had written the handwritten line at the bottom last, after everything else was done, sitting alone at the table with a pen. Now he was looking at a much larger table covered in maps, technical drawings, orbital diagrams, and the beginnings of things that did not have names yet because they had never existed before. Around him sat engineers, physicists, weapons designers, aerospace specialists, and people from agencies whose names were not printed anywhere public. They had all been told the same thing when they walked in: everything they knew about defense had been built to fight other humans. That was no longer the mission. The mission was bigger now. And it would need to move fast. Paul looked at the faces around the table. Some of them were tired. Some of them were scared. All of them were focused in the specific way that people focus when the problem in front of them is enormous and real and there is no one else to solve it. "All right," he said. His voice was calm. It was always calm. "We have a fleet coming. What do we have, and what can we build, and how long do we have to build it?" The room started talking. Outside, the sun was going down over the city. People were cooking dinner, watching screens, putting children to bed. The world was doing what the world always does, moving forward, moment by moment, ordinary and strange and completely itself. Above it, just barely visible if you knew where to look, a sovereignty drone circled silently and sent its feed back to Gorash's station, where an officer filed it under routine surveillance, the way he always did. He did not yet know that the filing system was about to become irrelevant. The council watched in horror. They had actually declared war on Earth. Part 3. Admiral Shurev had never lost a battle. He was Cathari, tall, armored, old in the way that military commanders become old, not soft but worn smooth, like stone in a river. He had been given command of the fleet assigned to Earth because he was the council's most reliable instrument, and they wanted this handled cleanly. 200 warships. The kind of force that did not leave room for doubt. He had used smaller fleets to bring entire civilizations to heel. 200 warships against a species with no energy shielding and no faster-than-light travel felt less like a battle and more like a formal announcement. He had been told the engagement would last 3 days. He began to suspect, approximately 40 minutes after crossing into the outer solar system, that someone had made a serious mistake. The humans had spent 17 years preparing. That was the fact that the council had not properly accounted for. In the sovereignty's experience, 17 years was nothing, barely a moment in the life of a civilization. But 17 years was also enough time for a species that had been building weapons almost continuously for 10,000 years, a species that had already split the atom and sent objects beyond its own atmosphere, to do a very great deal if it was properly motivated. The ultimatum had properly motivated them. Paul Decker's table had produced things in those 6 days and the weeks that followed. The engineers and physicists and weapons designers had not built from scratch, they had taken what existed and pushed it far beyond where it had been. Mass drivers had been mounted in the asteroid belt, using the raw rock of space itself as cover. Kinetic impactor systems had been calculated down to angles and timings that no known sovereignty targeting computer would anticipate, because those computers had been trained against sovereignty tactics, and sovereignty tactics were the only tactics they had ever seen. The humans had many different kinds of tactics. They disagreed with each other constantly about which tactics were best. They had dozens of schools of military thinking that argued, competed, and contradicted each other. Paul Decker had looked at this, which most people would have seen as a weakness, and decided it was the most powerful thing they had. So he used all of them at once. The first wave hit Shurev's fleet before any alarm had fully sounded. Tungsten rods, each one precisely weighted and angled, came from directions that made no tactical sense because they had been designed by people who were not following any recognized tactical playbook. 11 ships were struck in the first 4 minutes. 3 were destroyed outright. 8 lost engine capacity and fell out of formation. Shurev ordered a defensive spread. His fleet moved into a standard Cathari counterformation, a pattern that had worked against every enemy they had faced in the last 2,000 years. It did not work here, because the humans had studied Cathari counterformations and had specifically designed the second wave to hit them. The second wave came from below the ecliptic plane, a direction Shurev's sensors were watching, but not watching carefully enough, because no serious military force in sovereignty history had ever used that angle for a sustained assault. It was considered impractical. It required extreme fuel expenditure and left the attacking craft vulnerable on the way in. The humans had decided that vulnerable on the way in was acceptable if the outcome was worth it. 14 more ships were hit. 2 sovereignty cruisers collided with each other trying to adjust to the new attack vector, which added 2 more to the disabled list without a single human weapon involved. Then the small craft arrived. They were called different things by different branches of the human military. Some called them interceptors. Some called them void runners. The pilots who flew them had their own names for them, most of which were not printable in formal reports. They were fast and small, so small that sovereignty sensors, built to track vessels of meaningful tonnage, kept losing them in the noise. They were crewed by people who had grown up flying aircraft in weather systems, racing machines at dangerous speeds, doing things that most species in the sovereignty would have classified as reckless to the point of being a medical problem. One of those pilots was a young man named Danny Ruiz from a small city in New Mexico. Danny had been flying since he was 16 years old, had logged more hours in high-performance craft than almost anyone in his unit, and had a particular habit of doing things that his instructors had told him were impossible and then explaining afterward, usually with a shrug, that he had just tried it and it seemed to work. Danny flew his craft directly into the heat shadow of a Cathari cruiser's engine array, which was the one place on that ship where the sensor net had a blind spot because the engineers who designed the Cathari cruiser had never imagined that anything would be small enough and crazy enough to sit there. In that blind spot, moving at a speed that made his own ship's systems complain loudly, he delivered a shaped charge directly to the cruiser's primary drive housing. The cruiser's drive went offline. The ship drifted. Danny was already gone. He did that 3 more times before his fuel reserves made him pull back. He was not alone. There were hundreds of craft like his, all across the battle space, all doing things that did not follow a single unified plan because they had been trained to think independently and adapt in real time. Some were attacking engines. Some were cutting communication arrays. Some were doing things that even Paul Decker had not specifically ordered, because the pilots had seen opportunities and taken them, which was something the sovereignty's military doctrine actively discouraged and human doctrine actively encouraged. On Shurev's command ship, the tactical display was a disaster. Not a chaotic disaster, a precise one. That was what Shurev could not understand. Each human strike was specific. They were not spraying fire randomly. They were not throwing themselves at his ships in emotional waves the way some species did. They were targeting specific systems, specific weak points, specific angles that created specific problems, and they were doing it while moving in ways that his tracking systems had to keep recalculating from scratch. "Sir," his tactical officer said, and there was something in her voice that Shurev had not heard from her before. "They are not pulling back. I can see that. We outnumber them significantly. Normally, species in this position begin to withdraw at this point." Shurev stared at the display. "How much damage have we taken?" She hesitated. 31 ships destroyed or disabled, sir. We have confirmed enemy craft destroyed at approximately 6. The number sat in the air of the command room. No one said anything. Shurev was a calm being. He had built his career on staying calm. But looking at that display, watching those small fast craft move through his fleet like they had been born doing it, reading damage reports that kept coming in faster than his officers could process them, he felt something he had not felt in decades. He felt uncertainty. "They're getting closer," the tactical officer said. "I know. Sir, they appear to be aiming for our communications array on the port side. Reroute through secondary. The secondary array was hit 4 minutes ago." Shurev turned and looked at his officer. She looked back at him. Around them, the room was quiet despite everything happening outside, quiet the way rooms get when people are processing something that has not finished arriving yet. Outside the ship's hull, in the cold and silent space between planets, Danny Ruiz was lining up his next approach, humming something under his breath, his eyes tracking 3 different things at once the way pilots do when they have been flying so long it stops being work and becomes something closer to instinct. He was not afraid. He was, if anything, in the best mood he had been in all week. That was the part, had Shurev known it, that would have frightened him the most, not the tactics, not the technology, not even the numbers. The fact that on the other side of this battle, the humans were not suffering through it. They were not enduring it. They were doing what they had always done, what 10,000 years of history had made them into. They were in their element. The council watched in horror. They had actually declared war on Earth. Part 4. The reports came in through the night cycle of the council station. They came one after another, each one worse than the last, each one a little harder to read than the one before it. The council secretary, a careful and experienced Prithian named Vasra who had held her position for 30 years and had handled more difficult meetings than most beings would ever attend, sorted and read each report before passing it to the chamber, and for the first time in her career she found herself reading the same lines twice, not because the language was unclear but because the numbers did not look like numbers she recognized from any previous engagement file. By the time the full council had assembled in the chamber, the early count was already troubling. By the time they had been sitting for 4 hours, it had become something else entirely. Vorik of the Kethari had not moved from his seat. He sat in his section with his armored hands folded on the desk in front of him and his wide eyes fixed on the main display screen, which was showing a real-time tactical feed from Shurev's fleet. The feed updated every few minutes. Every update showed more red markers, disabled ships, destroyed ships, ships that had fallen out of formation and drifted. The number of human craft lost on the same feed was so small that Vorik had checked twice with Vasra to confirm the count had not been entered incorrectly. It had not been entered incorrectly. Around the circular chamber, 47 species sat in varying degrees of stillness. Some were very quiet. Some were speaking in low voices to the members of their own sections. A few were reading from personal tablets, scrolling through the longer history files that the intelligence division had prepared years ago and that almost no one had fully read until tonight. Prieva of the Aluan raised a tentacle. Priva's species was old, older than most in the chamber. They were pale and tall and moved slowly and had not fought a war in 3,000 years, not because they were weak but because they had long ago decided that conflict was a poor way to solve problems and had built their entire civilization around that belief. They were quiet members of the council, usually. They voted carefully. They spoke rarely. When Prieva spoke, people listened, not out of fear but out of the particular respect that is given to beings who choose their words slowly. "How many ships have we lost?" Prieva asked. Vasra looked at her tablet. 63 confirmed destroyed or disabled as of the last update. And the humans? 11 craft confirmed destroyed. 14 damaged but still operational. The chamber was very quiet. 63, Prieva said again, not as a question. Just holding the number in the air. A council member from the Durith collective shifted in his seat. The Durith communicated through color changes in their skin, and the member's color had been moving steadily from his normal warm brown through a pale gray and was now settling into something close to dark amber, which anyone who knew the Durith would recognize as barely controlled anger. He had been cycling through these colors for the past 2 hours. Now he spoke. "I want to know," he said, and his voice was controlled but the amber in his skin was very deep, "who signed off on the threat assessment for this species?" Nobody answered immediately. "The assessment was completed," Vorik said. The assessment, the Durith member said, did not account for the fact that this species has never been conquered. Not once. Not in 10,000 years of continuous recorded conflict. Not by any outside force. Not by any internal one. They have fought each other without stopping and they are still there. Every single time. He reached forward and pulled up the human history list on the main display, the same list that Paul Decker had included with the declaration. Projected onto the large screen that filled one wall of the chamber, it was enormous. Thousands of entries. Dates and names and places and numbers that stretched back further than most civilizations in the council had been keeping written records. The chamber read it in silence. There was a particular kind of silence that happens when a group of intelligent beings all realize, at approximately the same moment, that they have made a significant mistake. It is not loud. It does not involve raised voices or sudden movement. It is very still and very heavy, and it has a texture that those who have experienced it do not forget. That was the silence in the chamber now. A young council staffer named Yessa was sitting at the edge of the room near the communication terminals. She was 24 years old, newly appointed, and she had spent the last 4 hours sending and receiving messages and doing her best to keep up with a situation that was moving faster than any training had prepared her for. She leaned toward her supervisor, an older Kethari official named Drath, and whispered something. Drath listened. He looked at the screen. He whispered back. Yessa looked at the screen again. She looked at the red markers on the tactical display, the fleet that the Council had sent, the fleet that was the largest single military force deployed in over 200 years, sitting out there in the space around a blue and white planet, losing ships to things it had not been designed to fight. How is that possible? She whispered, not really to Drath, just to the air. Drath did not answer. In the observers' gallery above the main floor, there was a seat that had been empty for most of the session. It was not marked or assigned. Visitors occasionally used the gallery during open hearings, but this session had not been open to visitors, and no one had thought to check whether anyone was already sitting up there. Lyra Sohn had been in that seat for 3 hours. She had come back to the station after delivering the declaration and had not left. She had filed no paperwork, made no formal request. She had simply walked to the gallery entrance, sat down in a seat near the back corner, and watched. The Council was so consumed with its own situation that no one had looked up. She watched Vorik. She watched the display. She watched the Durith members' skin cycle through colors. She watched Pre-Eva of the Aluan sit with the stillness of a species that had lived long enough to know when something important was happening and had learned to give it proper attention. Then the Durith member said something that made the room go even quieter than before. They are not killing our crews. Vasra looked at her tablet. That is correct. Ships that have been boarded by human craft report that crew members were removed, disarmed, and transferred. Current intelligence indicates they are being held in facilities aboard human vessels. Reports from recovered communication fragments suggest they are being given food, water, and medical attention. They are taking prisoners, Pre-Eva said. Yes. Why? Vorik's hands were still folded. His eyes had not moved from the screen. We do not know. It is not mercy, the Durith member said slowly. His skin had shifted to something between amber and a dark, uncertain green. Or it is not only mercy. A species that fights like this does not stop fighting out of softness. There is a reason they are keeping our people alive. He paused. They are thinking past this battle. That landed in the room the way a large stone lands in still water, with a sound, and then a spreading. A military species that had 10,000 years of war behind it, that was outperforming a sovereignty fleet by a margin that made the tactical officers' reports embarrassing to read, that was taking prisoners rather than killing them, that was a species that was not simply reacting. That was a species that had a plan. That was a species that knew something about how this ended and had already made decisions about it. They expected us, someone said from across the chamber. No one turned to see who had said it. Vorik finally moved. He unclenched his hands and placed them flat on the desk. He breathed in through the filters of his chest plates. Then Lyra spoke. She did not shout or stand dramatically. She simply spoke from the gallery in a clear, normal voice, and the sound of it made every head in the chamber turn upward at once. They did not expect you, she said. They planned for you. There is a difference. Expecting means waiting for something to happen. Planning means deciding what you will do when it does. She looked across the chamber at 47 species looking back at her. My people have been at war almost continuously for 10,000 years. Every one of those wars taught them something. Every loss taught them something. Every win taught them something. And all of that learning has been sitting in books and records and the memories of institutions for generations, waiting for a time when it would be needed. She paused. You gave them a time when it was needed. The chamber said nothing. Lyra looked at Vorik. You thought we would be afraid, she said. We were afraid. We are afraid right now. But you made one mistake. You thought fear would stop us. It never has. Not once. That was in the files, Ambassador. Someone should have read them. The Council watched in horror, they had actually declared war on Earth. Part 5. Admiral Shurev requested the ceasefire on the 22nd day. He did not have permission from the Council to make that request. He knew that. He made it anyway, because he was a military commander with 61 ships remaining out of 200, and because he had spent 22 days watching his fleet be taken apart in ways that he still did not fully understand, and because there was a point at which continuing was not courage but something closer to waste. He had reached that point. He opened a communication channel through the frequencies the humans had been using to send standard identification signals, short bursts of code that identified human craft and kept them from firing on each other in the chaos. It had taken his signals officer 4 days to isolate the pattern, and another 2 to work out a format that would not be mistaken for an attack signal. When the channel opened, he had expected to wait. He did not wait. The response came in under 30 seconds. The face on the screen was a woman he had not seen before. She was not young, her hair was short and gray, and she had the kind of face that had been doing difficult things for a long time and had settled into a specific kind of quiet because of it. She wore a military uniform without decorations, which Shurev had been told was unusual for human commanders of her level. He did not know what to make of that. Her name was General Paula Owens. She was from a place called Georgia, which Shurev did not know and would not have known what to do with if he had. She had spent 30 years in uniform, had commanded operations on 3 different continents, and had been brought in to lead the Earth Defense Coordination 6 days after the ultimatum landed because Paul Decker had specifically asked for her by name and because everyone who had worked with her agreed on one thing: she did not get rattled. She did not look rattled now. "Admiral," she said. "General Owens." He paused. He was not accustomed to pausing in professional conversations, but the situation required it. "I would like to discuss terms." "Terms for what specifically?" "For ending this engagement." She looked at him for a moment. Her expression did not change. "Are you surrendering?" "I am requesting a ceasefire." "Those are 2 different things." "Yes," he said. "I am aware." She was quiet for a moment. Through the channel, Shurev could hear faint background sounds from her side, a low hum of equipment, a distant voice saying something he couldn't make out, the small ordinary sounds of a working command room. It sounded calm. That bothered him more than he expected it to. Paula leaned back slightly in her seat. "Admiral, I'll be direct with you. We don't want your ships. We don't want your territory. We are not planning to march into your council chamber and take seats at your table. What we want is simple, and we haven't changed our position on it since the first day." She folded her hands. "Leave our solar system. Remove Earth from any list you maintain of species subject to sovereignty, authority, or oversight. And make sure every member of your council understands, in detail, what happened here, not a summary, not a softened version, the actual account, so that no one makes this decision again." Shurev absorbed this. He had been in negotiations before. He understood the structure of them. There was always a starting position and a real position. You stated what you wanted to begin with, and then you moved toward what you would actually accept. It was a process. It had a shape. This did not have that shape. "That is the full extent of your demands," he said. "Those are our terms. Not demands. Terms. You do not want reparations. Formal recognition. Resources. A position within the sovereignty structure." Paula Owens looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has just been asked a question they find genuinely strange. "We have a planet," she said. "It's a very good planet. We like running it ourselves. We have been running it ourselves for a long time, and we intend to keep doing that." Shurev sat with that for a moment. In his experience, when a military force won a significant engagement against a larger opponent, it used that victory as leverage for something. Territory. Tribute. Political standing. Safety guarantees backed by formal treaty. That was how power worked. You built it, you traded it, you converted it into something lasting. The humans apparently wanted to convert it into being left alone. He did not fully understand that. But he also recognized that he was sitting in a damaged command ship with 61 functioning vessels behind him and a human tactical force that had shown, over 22 days, that it could be extremely creative about finding new problems for him, and that debating the philosophy of human ambition was perhaps not the best use of his remaining time. "I will need to communicate with the council," he said. "That's fine," Paula said. "You have 48 hours. After that we assume you have chosen to continue." The channel closed. On the council station, the session had been running almost without break for 3 days. Members had rotated in and out for sleep and food, but the chamber itself was never empty. Vasra had been at her station for so long that her supervisor had twice told her to go rest, and twice she had said she would go in another hour, and twice she had not gone. When Shurev's communication with Paula Owens was relayed to the chamber, the room watched it in complete silence. The feed was slightly delayed, the distance made real-time impossible, but the words came through clearly enough. Vorik listened without expression. When it finished, Pre-Eva of the Aluan was the first to speak. "They want nothing," she said. Not with surprise. More with something that sounded like recognition. "They want to be left alone," the Durith member said. His skin had settled into a steady gray, which for a Durith meant something between exhaustion and acceptance. "That is what they have always wanted. We came to them. We made demands of them. They told us no and proved they meant it." He stopped. "And now they are asking us to leave and not come back, and they are not even asking us to say we were wrong." "They don't need us to say it," Lyra said. She was still in the gallery. She had been there through most of it. No one had asked her to leave, and she had not offered to go. "They already know they were right," she continued. "They don't need the council to confirm it. They just want it to stop." Yessa, the young staffer at the communication terminal, had been listening to all of this for hours. She had not said much. She was at a level of her career where her job was mostly to listen and file things and make sure the right messages went to the right terminals, and she had done all of that, but she had also been thinking, the way young people think when they are watching something large happen around them and trying to understand where it fits in the shape of things. She looked at the blank screen where the feed from Shurev's channel had played. She looked at the tactical display, where 61 red markers sat in a loose cluster at the edge of the human solar system. She leaned toward Drath. "Are we going to agree to their terms?" Drath watched the chamber. Vorik was speaking quietly with 2 other Kethari members. Pre-Eva was still. The Durith member was writing something on a personal tablet. "Yes," Drath said. "Because we have to." Drath thought about this for a moment. "Because it is the correct decision," he said. "And because the alternative is sending more ships, and we do not know how many more ships it would take, and I am no longer certain there is a number large enough." The ceasefire agreement was signed the following afternoon. It was a short document. Paula Owens signed it in a room in Washington with Paul Decker sitting beside her and a small group of people around the table who had been working without much sleep for 3 weeks. When the signatures were confirmed and the communication went out, the room was quiet for a moment, and then someone started clapping, and then others joined, and it was not a loud celebration, it was the sound of people who were very tired and very relieved and who would, in a few days, begin to think about what came next. Shurev's fleet began its withdrawal that evening, moving slowly back through the asteroid belt and out toward the edge of the system. It was a long journey and a quiet one. The ships that were most damaged were assisted by the ones that were less damaged, which was standard procedure. The prisoners that had been held on human vessels were returned, unharmed, as Paula had said they would be. On Earth, the news moved fast. People watched feeds, read reports, called each other. In cities and towns and small places that most people had never heard of, people stood in kitchens and offices and parking lots and processed the fact that a fleet from the larger galaxy had come and had been sent back, and that the world was still there, and that tomorrow would still arrive. In a government building in Washington, Colin Hartley, the junior advisor from Indiana who had asked the first question, all those weeks ago, in the United Nations gallery, was handed a printed copy of the signed agreement by a colleague. He read it. It took him about a minute. Then he set it on his desk, put on his jacket, and picked up his bag. "Where are you going?" his colleague asked. "Home," Colin said. "I have a budget report due tomorrow and I haven't started it." He walked out of the office and into the hallway and down the stairs and out into the street, where the evening air was cool and the city was doing what cities do, moving and humming and not stopping for anything, not even history. Above him, though he could not see it, the last Sovereignty cruiser cleared the orbit of Neptune and set its heading for open space. The stars around it were the same stars they had always been, old and far and completely indifferent to the small struggles of small beings in the long dark between them. But somewhere in that dark, 47 species were updating their files. Adding new information. Reclassifying a blue planet in a quiet arm of the galaxy, moving it from the column marked primitive and manageable to a column that had not needed many entries before and that no one in the council had ever expected to expand. Earth had its own column now. It simply said, "Do not approach without invitation." That was enough.